I see we have a full house. This is great. I have the pleasure of introducing Tony Cohen. He is a historian. He is a fourth-generation descendant of a runaway slave. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that he is one of our own. He was a student here at Montgomery College, which is always worth mentioning. Tony's work springs from his 1996 two-month-long journey to explore a tragically overlooked part of American history, the Underground Railroad, the secret network which thousands of slaves traveled to attain their freedom. Cohen began his trek in Sandy Spring, Maryland, traveling a distance of 1,200 miles by foot, boat, and rail to his final destination in Amherstburg, Ontario. In 1997, Cohen prepared television icon Oprah Winfrey for her role as Seth in the film Beloved. Blindfolded and dropped on a Maryland plantation, Cohen transported Oprah back to the time of slavery, where for 2 days and nights she lived as a fugitive on a simulated underground railroad, an experience which she later claimed as an inspiration for her Change Your Life TV show. So without further ado, let me introduce Tony Cohen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening. How's everyone tonight? Good. Thank you for inviting me here this evening to share this story with you. I'm going to speak tonight a bit about slavery, in particular the Underground Railroad, what it was as part of our past, what remains of it today, and specifically stories of how I've interpreted and tried to revive parts of that history. But first, I'd like to start with a little bit of background. My name is Tony Cohen, C-O-H-E-N, which is a Jewish name, and that is what actually got me interested in history. All my life, people have asked, how does a black guy end up with a Jewish name? And I'm not Jewish, and I always used to say, I don't know. And then in 1989, I called my grandfather, who was living in LA, and I said, Granddad, how did we get the name? And he told me that his father, my great-grandfather, had been born in Philadelphia during the Civil War, orphaned, and adopted by a Jewish family from Wilmington, Delaware. And when I heard that, the theme song to Roots was in my head, and I thought, yeah, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to trace my history, and I'm going to find the Jewish family, and I'm going to knock on their door, and surprise! Didn't quite work out that way. I actually hit a dead end with that line. But I started tracing other lines of my family history, and in the course of about 3 or 4 years, I could trace my ancestry back to 10 different ethnicities, 3 continents, and some lines back 500 years. And I discovered that, I guess, the history of the world flowed through my veins. Well, fast forward a couple of years, I was a student at American University after my time here at Montgomery College. And I was in a history class and was given an assignment for my senior project to document some part of history that had gone unrecorded. So I chose the topic of the Underground Railroad and had to face the first dilemma. How do you find and document something which is not there to be found? The Underground Railroad seemed like a really good topic because it was secretive in nature. Many of its details we still don't know today in terms of how it worked, who was involved, where the routes were, or the safe houses that people were given shelter in. And so I decided to approach my research topic the way I approached my search for my own family roots. And the first step was talking to living people, just asking around, hey, what do you know? At the time, I was a volunteer at the Montgomery County Historical Society, and I remember going in one weekend and speaking to one of the librarians there. And I told her about my topic and how I was going to research the Underground Railroad, at which point she informed me that there was no such thing as an Underground Railroad in Montgomery County. And then she went on to tell me that in the 1860 election, only 6 people in this county voted for Lincoln. And as she put it, there wasn't much support for the North, there wasn't much support for black people, and so no one would have helped them escape. Well, I thought that was a pretty amazing, opinion. So I decided to keep asking. The next person I spoke to was a friend of mine who lived in a place called Sandy Spring, Quaker community near Olney. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And there I began to uncover the secrets of the Underground Railroad. In a short time, I found people living in that community whose families had gone back 200 years, had been slaveholders who had freed their slaves at the time of the Revolutionary War, and then over the ensuing decades became involved tacitly in the abolitionist movement. One family actually showed me letters, which appeared to be coded letters, describing the forwarding of packages, large and small, to family members in Philadelphia, which we believed was a code for the forwarding of fugitives. After that, I went back to the local library and I started researching through all of the newspapers of the 1850s. Now, if you were a fugitive on the Underground Railroad, escaping from your home in slavery, your owner would have put an ad in the paper. And it would have given you a physical description, your height, skin color, what you were wearing, so on and so forth. But I also discovered that many of these ads mention routes that would have been used, aliases and disguises, costumes that some slaves took along to disguise themselves, destinations where they thought people were going to, and the modes of transportation. After that, I was able to use those records to then go to the Library of Congress, where I found actual narratives or biographies or autobiographies by the slaves who had escaped and got to freedom in the North. And there, they gave details of how they made their journeys out, who helped them along the way, and what happened once they reached their final destination. Well, over a 6-month period, I gathered all this information. I wrote my paper. I got an A. And then I graduated from American University with a degree in history, at which point I faced a mystery even greater than that of the Underground Railroad, which is, what do you do with a history degree? Well, at the time, I really wasn't, interested in really, diving back into academia or teaching or anything like that. That summer, I decided to keep volunteering at the Montgomery County Historical Society when the same librarian who said there was no Underground Railroad suggested that I take my paper and, with the aid of the Historical Society, publish it as a booklet. And I gotta remember, I have a PowerPoint here. Freedom, people escaping on the Underground Railroad. My booklet, there we go. And so the Historical Society got a grant. They whittled down my 50-page student paper to a 40-page booklet called The Underground Railroad in Montgomery County, A History and Driving Guide. And it had in it the background on the Underground Railroad in Montgomery County, the different stations that were used on the Underground Railroad and other associated sites, all pulled together on a map. So you could actually get in your car and you could drive from one point to the other and whatnot. We had 500 of these things printed up December of 1994. And once it hit the stands, I thought my connection with the Underground Railroad had finally come to an end. Then about 6 weeks later, Black History Month, February 1995, I get a call from the Historical Society. And they're calling to say that all the books are gone, 500 copies in 6 weeks. I had an instant bestseller. Now, I didn't make any money off of it. But the public library system in the county, Howard and Prince George's bought a bunch. The school system, they even sold it at Crown Books, if you can remember that thing. Then I started being asked to go out and speak in public, in particular to school groups. And I had never spoken in public, and I always get a little nervous at first, but this was my very first appearance, and it was for a group of fourth graders at a school called Green Acres in Rockville, Maryland. And so, I put on my suit and tie, and I go in there, and they have the kids in an all-purpose room, about 250 kids, and a little voice in my ear said, Tony, just don't bore them to death. And so, instead of throwing a lot of facts and figures at them like I just did you, I said, who here can tell me what the Underground Railroad was? Well, one boy raised his hand and he said, the Underground Railroad was neither underground nor railroad. I'm thinking, yep, that's very good. That's a great start. And who can tell me where it went to? And a girl raised her hand and she says, well, usually the North, the free states above the Mason-Dixon line. But she said, if you were a slave in Texas, you weren't going to escape to the north or on to Canada. You would go south into Mexico. And she was right. And then other kids started talking about the abolitionist movement and Missouri Compromise and the suppression of the slave trade. And I'm sitting there thinking, what am I doing here? So, not to be outdone by fourth graders, I said, great, obviously you know all about this Underground Railroad, but who here has ever traveled the Underground Railroad? Well, that fixed them. They completely silent. And their school, which is in the Tilden Woods section of Rockville, was actually, I would say, maybe 3 blocks or so from Rockville Pike, which was one of the escape routes on the Underground Railroad I had documented. And I asked them, how many of you come to school every day by way of Rockville Pike? Half of the hands were raised. And I said, you have traveled the Underground Railroad. And I began telling them stories of how that route had been used. Well, my stories must have been, really visual and whatnot, because one boy raised his hand and says, Mr. Cohen, were you afraid when you escaped on the Underground Railroad? Thinking that I was a runaway slave. Yeah. Had to explain I wasn't that old, but it was really amazing because, when I was his age, history was something that just bored me to tears, but I liked old things. And I never really made the connection until later, because history was something you got out of a musty textbook. Well, the kids are all kind of excited about the Underground Railroad in their community, and probably about a week later. I'm in my office, going through some records, and I used to take these maps as I was doing my project. I would have these maps of Montgomery County, Eastern Seaboard, all of the places that I was finding in the slave narratives and historical records where fugitives that I had documented had gone to, what paths they had taken. And it just dawned on me that all of these lines snaking out of our county went to other places. And I thought to myself, wow, the real story would be what happens, if you were to, say, follow one of these routes. Say from Montgomery County, follow Rockville Pike into Frederick, and do the same kind of research there. And so I was kind of envisioning a bigger project. And then I thought, well, you'd actually want to do it as if you were a fugitive slave, by foot, by horse and buggy, whatever methods were still available, to keep you as close to those routes and those places and those potential stories as you could be, instead of driving on past. It was an interesting thought, but wholly impractical. As much as I'd love to do something like that, who had the time to walk the Underground Railroad from Maryland to Canada? And then it dawned on me I was unemployed and had the summer off, and hey, why not walk to Canada? So I thought, maybe I should get a second opinion. So the very next time I was invited to speak to a school, I boldly announced that the following spring, May of 1996, I was going to walk the route of the Underground Railroad from Sandy Spring, Maryland to Ontario, using only the methods that were available to the fugitive slaves of the time. Well, this time I was in front of fifth graders, and immediately all the hands went up. Well, which route will you take? And will you carry a backpack? And if so, what's inside of it? And of course, the thing they most wanted to know, if you're walking in the middle of the night and you're in the middle of nowhere and you need to go to the bathroom, what are you going to do then? To which I said, what would you do then? I will not give you the answer. But he gave me an idea, and I immediately threw the questions back at the students. And in this particular group, it was a geography class, a social studies class, and a home ec class. They brought all the students together. So we had the geography teacher take his students, and they figured out what the longest and shortest, most rural and most urban routes that I could take between Maryland and Canada to make my journey. The home economic students came up with their idea of what a well-balanced diet would entail and what kind of food and supplies I should take. And all of these kids are in their little breakout groups, and they're planning this trip for me. And then a girl in the back of the room raises her hand and says, Mr. Cohen, I don't think you should go on this trip because my mom says there are white people who don't like black people, and if you walk through their town, they'll put a sheet over their head and they'll chase you. The Klan. And as soon as she raised the specter, all the kids got scared. But then, one by one, they started suggesting ways that I could heavily arm myself. Machine guns, tasers, machetes. One boy said that his father was a member of the National Rifle Association, and he'd get me in on target practice. And then there was a girl who said that she had read the biography of Harriet Tubman, the fugitive slave from Maryland who escaped in 1849 and came back, we believe, 13 times and rescued extended members of her family over a 10-year period. And every time she made the journey, she was alleged to have carried a pistol, and it was said that she never lost a passenger. Now, I wasn't going to pack heat, but I thought, wow, here these kids are in present time, putting themselves in the footsteps of these people of the past. And I thought that if time was rolled back and they found themselves in that period, they would at least have the wherewithal to consider how to make their journey to freedom. So over the next few months, I went from school to school actually having kids plan my journey. One kid said, I think it was December of '95, that I needed something called an internet website. Of course, the early years of the web. And soon after that, I partnered with the National Park Service because they were doing an Underground Railroad study through their parks and had discovered that I was passing through 3 national parks that had connections to the Underground Railroad. So they put up my webpage. And on that, we put my itinerary, where I anticipated being on each day of the journey. And by the time that I left on May 6, 1996, we had received so many emails from people who had found the information on the National Park site that people started sending me invites to stay with them. And by the time I left, I had a place to stay every night at every point on my journey between Maryland and Canada. So the Underground Railroad of old and the information superhighway melded together, and a new line of egress was created. Well, I started out from Sandy Spring. I walked 10 to 25 miles a day. I saw lots along the way, but each day I tried to find out more about the Underground Railroad. So I would stop in towns along the way. In a small town, I would always look for a library or historical society and ask people what information they had. In lieu of that, I would go to a post office in a small town because the postmaster always knows who the oldest person is or who the town historian is. And I got great information that way. In lieu of that, I would go to a realtor's office because they knew the history of the oldest homes in the community. And they would call people up and say, hey, I got a guy here walking to Canada. Let him in your basement. So I was able to see things that I normally would have otherwise passed by. It took me, 3 hours to walk 10 miles and a full 12 hours to walk 25 miles. And my longest day on foot I did in 42 miles, from dusk to dawn, along a section of the Underground Railroad that went along the Erie Canal. So lots of things happened on my journey. I'll tell you one story in particular. When I got to Philadelphia, I was about 10 days into my walk, and somehow National Public Radio had heard about my journey and tracked me down on the road to where I was staying, and I got a call and did an interview. Later that day, I was invited to speak at a Quaker school. And I remember talking to the kids about, how I was making my journey and what I had seen along the way. And one kid asked me, Mr. Cohen, can you tell me what was the greatest escape on the Underground Railroad? Well, the Underground Railroad was secretive, and we do know a good amount about it, but many of the escape methods were kept secret so that others could use those methods to get out, and so the system wouldn't be compromised. So I told him I didn't know what the greatest one was, but I told him what my favorite one was, and that was the escape of Henry Box Brown. I gotta keep remembering that I have this here. The Underground Railroad of old, that's me preparing for my walk. I did not wear that on my walk. That was just my little website shot. That's me on my journey. Smithsonian came out for 10 days and followed me on my walk. And here we go. So, I tell the story of Henry Box Brown, right here as you see him. An enslaved man in Richmond, Virginia, who in 1849, same year that Harriet Tubman made her escape, he ventured out to freedom. But he decided not to go on foot. A friend of his built a crate, put him inside, and literally mailed him to the north. Today, you want to send a package overnight, you send it Federal Express. Back then, there was a company called Adams Express. And so he was put in the crate, put on the back of a wagon, which took him to a steamboat in Richmond, which made its way to Washington, where it was transferred back onto a wagon to an awaiting train that eventually ended up in Philadelphia. 26 hours nailed inside of his crate. And you know how the story goes. It said this side up. Yeah, halfway through the journey, they turned that side upside down, and he spent the last 11 hours traveling on his head. The box arrives at the office of the Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. The members gather around. A crowbar is procured, and the lid is loosened from the crate. Removed, and inside they discover the body of Henry Box Brown, which stirred, and then he rose to his feet, a free man in the North. I'm telling this to kids, and they go, wow, how did he breathe? And what did he eat in the box? And of course, their favorite question, the bathroom, yeah. Some things, fortunately, history does not record. That is one of them. Well, at this point, I had gotten probably about 4 days behind in my schedule for my walk. The media got the story. News crews would actually find me on the road walking and do impromptu interviews. I mean, it was crazy. People would put me up at their homes and make me stay an extra day and feed me gourmet meals and all just sorts of crazy stuff. I didn't feel like a runaway slave, but I needed to make up time. And so I was sitting there thinking, wow, I wish I could get in a box and get shipped off, make up some of these miles I've lost. And then I thought, that's an idea. What if I were to reenact, if you will, Henry Box Brown's escape? Well, not only would it help me make up time, but it would solve a dilemma that I couldn't get my head around, and that was how I could walk the route of the Underground Railroad, see the places, talk to the descendants of slaves and slaveholders and the people who helped them, see the artifacts and the ephemera and the safe houses and the community, but not have a sense myself of what it was actually like to be a fugitive slave. So I thought, if I was put in a box, maybe I would have some of the same fear factor that Henry had. So I thought, why don't I call Amtrak, tell them what I'm doing, and get permission to go inside of a crate on one of their trains, let's say from Philadelphia to New York. 2 hours, short and sweet. I get the experience a la Henry Box Brown. Then I thought, nah, Amtrak would never give me permission. Wait, Henry didn't ask Amtrak for permission or whatever the train was at the time. He went illegally. I could do that today. I could get people to help me on the train, smuggle me on. And then perhaps I'd have a degree of the same fear factor. So I called my friends in D.C., a cameraman named Bill Corey, who was filming portions of the walk. He would come up on weekends. And my walk coordinator, Sunny Matama. And she was, answering the phones and the email and the media requests. And they would come up on the weekends. I'd get rid of my backpack, and I'd be able just to walk, and they'd kind of be my support. So they came up that weekend, and I said, hey, here's what I'm thinking. And Bill, who's always nervous about everything, says, yeah, we'd love to put you in a box and ship you off to the middle of nowhere. So the journey was on. We got $88 of lumber from Heckingers. We have Heckingers up there. And we began to construct a crate. Now, my crate was 24 by 28 by 30 inches tall. And that gave me enough room to do this, and in a tight squeeze, I could get into this position. The crate was 6 panels, 4 sides, a top and a bottom, that we bound together using 3-inch screws. The only one we didn't screw into place was the front panel. We put it on hinges, attached that to the crate, had a latch, a hook latch inside, which would allow me to open and close it as such, lock it into place. And then so it would look like the rest of the box, we drilled 1/2-inch screws into the facade, so it looked like a solid structure. Well, I was in it. I fit just right. It was just my size. Air holes. I need air holes. Got to breathe. That's important. So we drilled holes about this big, 5 to each side around the top ledge of the crate. That allowed for a nice flow of air in and out. The only problem was we then realized anyone could just walk up to the crate, look in the hole, see me sitting there, and the jig is up. So then we got stickers, the kind you use to spell out your name on your mailbox, and we spelled out words covering the holes. So on one side, the 5 holes was B-O-O-K-S, books, indicating the alleged contents. And our plan was that the box would be pulled onto the coach car, where it would travel with Bill and Sonny. But on the end of the coach car, there's always an open space where you can pile up your luggage. That's where they were going to put me. Push me within an inch of the wall. And should I run out of air during the middle of the journey, all I had to do was push out one of the stickers, breathe from the aperture, and they would then restore the sticker before pulling me off the train. Then the next thing was we called Amtrak to figure out all the details. They learned the size of the box, and they said, well, it needs to be on a pallet so it can be easily moved. You know, I'm thinking one of the hand truck things and, you know, some people pulling it. And they said, make sure that it can be put on a pallet in the upright position. So we then put eye hooks along the bottom ledge of each side so we could run ropes through it. So there was no chance of them flipping it upside down. Well, we had everything planned out. May 17th, I think it was a Sunday. Previous day, I think the high was 76 degrees. That day, I'm put into the back of a van and driven to the 30th Street train station in Philadelphia. We arrive at 11:30 for a 12 noon train. When the box is taken out of the van, the temperature on the train building, the station building, said 89 degrees. By the time I reached New York, the temperature would have peaked at 99 degrees. My friends are outside the box. Tony, are you okay? Can you breathe in there? Barely. But I said, yeah, everything's fine. Knowing that in moments I would be on the train, I could open the door, get fresh air, walk around the car in the event that there was nobody there, good chance of that, and then get back in the crate. Well, they roll me up the ramp into the main concourse of the station, and the box comes to a standstill. Now, I'm in that squatting position. I can see everything in the crate where the boards were joined together. Little fissures of light would shoot between the cracks. So it was fully illuminated inside. I could hear, I'm guessing, maybe a 20-foot radius around me. The only thing I cannot do is see anything outside of the box. And so that the box could be moved easily, we had put on the back side of it caster wheels. So when the box needed to be moved, it was tipped on its side, and I rolled this way. That was a lot of fun. So the box is rolled. It comes to a stop. Zuni goes off to get help, directions of where to take this thing. Comes back with a gentleman who says, is that the crate you're sending? And she says, yes. He said, tickets, please. She said, we don't have our tickets yet. And he says, what train are you getting? She said, the 12 noon. He said, okay, go ahead, get your tickets now, come back, I'll have the paperwork, you can fill it out, you'll take the 12 noon train, and we can get the box to you in New York, usually within 72 hours. She said, oh, no, the box is going with us. He said, no, ma'am, the box is not going with you if you're going on the 12 noon train. If you wanted on the noon train, you should have been here a half an hour ago, because the box has to be weighed, paid for, and inspected. Inspected, which is what Suni said. And he said, yes, inspected. Is there something about the box I should know about? And she said, no, it's just full of jewelry and family heirlooms, and I don't want it out of my sight. And he said, well, you can take the 3:30 train, but it has to be on the platform by 1 p.m. for that. So he walks away. Zuni leans over the lid. Tony, did you hear that? I said, yes, Zuni. what should we do? And I said, the first thing you should do is stop talking to the box, okay? So they roll me into an alcove, and when the coast was clear, I came out. We were monitoring the check-in desk. About 10 minutes to 1, I get in the box. Things were going in and out of the desk. Nothing was getting inspected or anything like that. I'm rolled up to the counter. The box with me inside is placed on the scales, weighing in at 210 pounds. The cost to ship that one way from Philly to New York was $25. The cost of each coach ticket for Bill and Zuni was $75 apiece. So it's cheaper to go by crate than coach, but don't try it. Then they were told that it would have to go by freight, that it would not be traveling. So I was put on an elevator, taken down to the service level, and that's when they left me. And I won't go into everything that happened in this story. I'll just give you scenes. Within the first, I'd say half an hour, I had removed all the clothing I was wearing. The temperature was skyrocketing. Within 2 hours of having entered the box, there was so much moisture in the crate that humidity or perspiration, I don't know what it was collecting on the screw plates holding the lid of the box to the frame. And every 10 or 15 minutes, a droplet of water would fall from the roof into the chamber. The box was sweating for me. I remember at one time while I'm sitting on the platform, a truck came up and parked within feet of the box. You could hear the door open, person jump out, close the door, the person walks away, the engine is still idling, and now I'm smelling the fumes. And then the door opens and the truck moves away. Then on top of the lid I hear boom, 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 and then what sounded like sandpaper rubbing. Later, I would discover that was the shipping bills that they were putting on top of the box. Then, maybe an hour later, beep, 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 boom. Then, beep, 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 forklift. That's why they needed the pallet, so that they could lift me with the forklift. And this was pretty cool, because as it went up and down each of the corridors of the station, air was forced through the cracks of the crate, driving down the temperature. And they went to lunch for about an hour, whatever. Train comes roaring into the station. The engine is turned on to the forklift again, and I'm placed inside the car. Beep, 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 boom. Sound reverberates throughout the room as I'm dropped to the floor of the car. The machine withdraws, and then another parcel. Beep, 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 boom, right next to me. The machine withdraws, the door is rolled shut, and the train starts moving. And here I'm thinking, I'm burning up, I got to get out of this box. I start to go for the door, and then I'm like, I know there's me and another crate, and I kind of wanted, hello, anyone in there? But they say watch what you ask for, so I stay quiet. And the train is gaining speed, and as it is, the box is starting to shake and slowly lurch forward. And then, all of a sudden, what had been complete darkness inside of the box once I was put on the train became brilliant, beautiful sunlight trickling in. I'm like, we're out of the station. But wait a minute. I was put in a car, the door was closed, it's dark, I'm still in the car, where's the sun coming through? And what about all this wind? And I thought, well, maybe it was one of those open-air cattle cars. So I go to open the door only to realize I can't, because the ropes that were used to bind the crate to the pallet were blocking the door. Well, I was calm then, and I remember getting on my knee, on both knees, and putting my eye to the crack where the door was hinged. And as I peered out, I was in a closed freight car. But they had put me in the back door, and there was a second door in front of me, which, as the train left the station, had rolled open. And as I peered out, I could see the Pennsylvania countryside flying past at about 50 miles an hour. Now, I'm scared to death. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe about a half an hour later, the train stops. Some more workers get on it. I'm thinking, yes, gentlemen, put the bags over there. Please close the door on your way out. The train starts moving. These two guys are still on. One of them sees the crate, I guess figures it to be a good thing to sit on, comes, hops up on, and starts playing the bongos on the top of my crate. And it was funny because when we put the stickers on, we had all, we bought a sticker kit, so, 5 A's and, 5 of everything. So it had all these V's and W's that we didn't need, and I took the W's, flipped them upside down, and made one an M, and I used the V, and I scrawled on the front, Viva Freedom. And one of the guys says, what the heck does Viva Freedom mean? And I wanted to say, it means I'm in this box, and give them a scare, but you can't do that because then it would defeat the purpose. So they were on probably till about Princeton, New Jersey, and the temperature was just scorching. It finally got to the point where I stopped sweating and I was covered with a sticky mucilage, and a white sheen was all over my body. And I think it was like the minerals, the salt and minerals coming out of my pores. And then I thought, yikes, this isn't a good thing. Well, at that very moment, the train lurches and then slows and then starts a descent, slowly under the river, below the streets of Manhattan, where about 10 minutes later, it came to a complete and utter stop. The engine turned off, and I knew I was in New York City. I had made it to freedom. I'm like, yes! And I'm waiting, and at 5 minutes, 10 minutes, all of a sudden, after 15 minutes, the train roars back to life. Next stop, Boston. Where are my friends? Well, they had gotten off the train. They had taken the shipping bill to one of the attendants, and he looks up in his computer and he says, sorry, sir, there's no such box on this train. Bill said, he said, sir, this happens all the time. It's probably on the platform. We'll do our best to find it in the next day or two, and it can be delivered to you. He said, oh, no. I want to check every car. So they checked every car. When they got to the last one, there was the box. When they pulled it out, the shipping bill in Bill Corey's hand said, Bill Corey, care of Penn Station, New York City, and all the information. The one on my box said, Bill Corey, care of Sunnydale Farms, Park Slope, New York. And this is a place in Brooklyn where they make the little cardboard milks that go into school lunches. That's where they were going to send me via Boston. Well, they get me off of the train, onto an elevator, up to the main concourse of Penn Station, and that's when my journey came to an end. And I got to tell you, it was the most amazing moment probably of my life, because the box is being rolled. I'm hearing the station announcer over the intercom calling the arrivals and departures. I could hear someone either running up to say goodbye or hello to a loved one and hugging and all that kind of stuff. It was just the sounds of life, and I was so happy to be alive. And I remember Zuni leans over, Tony, are you in there? I'm like, yeah, I'm still in here, Zuni. Well, you can come out now. And I'm like, where are we? In the middle of the train station. I'm like, Zuni, stop talking to the box. So she rolls me into an alcove, and they loosen one of the ropes that was coming across the door. And she taps on the lid again, and she said, Tony, you may come out now. You are a free man. Woo, it was deep, let me tell you. And I unlatched the crate door, I pushed it open, my head had just cleared the lid when right in front of me was a sign that said, Amtrak Police, and I got right back into the box, and they had pushed me into the security guard's alcove. So, plan two. The ropes are secured again. I'm dollied onto another elevator and taken up to the street level. And if you've ever been to Penn Station in New York City, you know it's the site of Madison Square Garden. And on a Sunday, they always cordon off all the streets around the venue, so you can actually, when the concert or game is over, people will pour out in the streets without interrupting the traffic. So at 6:30, the box is placed on the street. Bill's over here filming. Sonny's over here doing a Choctaw Indian celebratory dance. I unlatch the door, come out, fist triumphant to the sky, wearing nothing but my boxer shorts. I turn around. The doors to Madison Square Garden fly open. Thousands of people pour in and around me, and not one head turned to look at me, and that's New York City for you. I think they thought I lived in the box. But when I came out of that crate, it was really a life-altering experience. I think I got a hint or an aroma of what Henry Box Brown got on his journey. But there was no way I could know what he experienced in nearly 40 years enslaved. That was just incredible. Here I was retracing the Underground Railroad. I'd been to New York, I'd been to Pennsylvania, I'd been to all these places where I was walking to. But every day that I traveled and got further from home, I've been away from home for years. But it was different being on the road on foot. I was so just homesick. And when my friends would come, it would mean more to me then on that trip than it ever had when I had them in my everyday life. It was really amazing. So, Henry had to escape bondage to find the promise of his future. I had to return to a virtual or simulated bondage to really grasp the freedom that I had taken for granted all of my life. And so in following Henry's steps, I learned more than I ever could from a textbook or a history lecture. Well, I'm not going to bore you with any more of my stories, but I just take you through a few images. You know who this is. Smithsonian Magazine followed me on the last 10 days of my walk. Oprah read it, had me on her show. And while I was sitting there on the stage during one of her commercial breaks, she leans over and she says, I just bought the rights to Toni Morrison's Beloved, and I'm going to play Seth, the fugitive slave, and I want to do just what you did. I want to walk the walk and smell the smells and taste the taste. And I'm thinking to myself, knock yourself out, sister, And I'm going to call you when the movie's about to shoot. So 6 months later, I get a call from Harpo Studios. Hi, this is so-and-so at Harpo. Are you Tony Cohen? I'm like, yes. You were on the Oprah Winfrey show? I said, yes. Well, Oprah said that you were going to take her on the Underground Railroad. When can we schedule that? And I said, how long does she have? And it was kind of back and forth, and then she got on the phone maybe an hour later and said, Tony, I need some kind of experience. And I said, well, what about I take you to a museum or a safe house on the Underground Railroad? She said, no, I need an experience. And I said, for what you want, we'd have to find an old plantation, blindfold you, take you there, secretly change you into slave clothing, and when the blindfold comes off, you'd have to live and work in this secret location as a plantation slave for the next 2 days and be hunted down at night and follow streams. And, I was just going on and on and on. She's like, oh my God, that's exactly what I want. And I thought, oh gosh, I got to find a plantation and I got to hunt her down and oh gosh. So, but the thing is, when Oprah asks you for anything, you just do it. So at the time I was working for Park and Planning Commission, and what we did was we used a farm in Sandy Spring that a friend of mine owned that abuts parkland. And we stitched together a 12-mile swath through northeastern Montgomery County where we could move her across a rural landscape where she would not see a telephone pole, a paved road, anything from the modern era. And we brought in reenactors to portray the people of the past. Black reenactors. Half of them were there to help her. Half of them were there to keep her in slavery, pulled straight from real people in the history books. white reenactors, half to help, half to hinder. And through her interaction, she'd have to figure out who was friend, who was foe. Well, she got there. We did what we call the regression. It was a little device we used to take her from the present and throw her in the past. When the blindfold came off, it was the year 1850. She worked on the plantation for probably 4 hours before she made her connection and escaped. Got to the first safe house. And we had planned everything. She was going to have to spend the first night in a cave, the second night in the loft of a barn. I got a guy from Frostburg who was going to come down with bloodhounds, hunt her down in the middle of the night. And I even remember being on her show when I was telling the box story, she actually brought out a box. She thought that was cute. She's like, well, I have something for you. And it was a replica of my box. And she made me get in, and she closed the door, and she wouldn't let me out. And I was like, okay. So she even commented, she said, you'd have to leave me on the plantation because you wouldn't have gotten me in that box. So when we planned this, when I got off the phone with her, the first call I made was to a carpenter of mine. I said, ever watch the Oprah Winfrey show? And he's like, no, I can't say I have. And I said, turn it on today, take a look at Oprah, figure out what size box she would fit in, and then subtract 3 inches from each dimension so that we can shove her in. But I have to tell you, Oprah, after 7 hours, had a complete emotional breakdown. And in that moment, when she couldn't go on, she had actually reached the first safe house. That was the best part. And then she couldn't go on. She said, Tony, this is too real. Maybe a month later, she went into King World, who was her production company at the time, and her contract was ending. And they didn't know if she was going to continue, and she said, I want to continue for another 5 years with the proviso that I can change the format of my show. And that's when she came up with Oprah's Angel Network, the Choose Your Life Award, Remembering Your Spirit, the whole Change Your Life TV that she then did for another decade. And a few months later, in an interview with Diane Sawyer, she said that Beloved was a life-altering experience for her, but that her immersion experience on the Underground Railroad was what made her realize the sacrifice that her forebears made so that she could be Oprah today. And she wanted to take that energy and kind of pay it forward. Then I started getting calls. Where's this immersion experience? How did we get it? And so there she is. She's looking a lot happy that that thing had ended. And here's what she said. More than anything else, this experience helped me to get into my role for Beloved. And the experience I had didn't leave me bitter. It left me with the greatest sense of light and hope. We took the synergy from this, created a nonprofit organization called the Monere Foundation, then went on the task of trying to find a home to build the Underground Railroad immersion experience, the Oprah experience. In 2008, we secured a 40-year lease with the State of Maryland Department of Natural Resources for the Button Farm Living History Center, right down the road off of Black Rock Road here in Germantown. And on this farm, we are restoring all the old buildings on about 40 acres of land and preparing the site to operate as a working model Maryland farm or plantation, where people actually get hands-on experiences that have them use history as a tool of change together. Just a quick tour of the farm. We have what we believe is a slave cemetery in one of our fields. We grow all the crops of the past. Here is tobacco we have. We grow cotton. Next year we're going to grow flax. The idea being that everything that's on the farm and that we need on the farm is produced there. So the flax will create linen. The linen will create clothing that our interpreters wear, and people going through the immersion experience will wear. So they'll get an experience as close to the feel of the time. This is our museum garden at Winter. We grow over 75 different varieties of heirloom vegetables and herbs, some of which we've researched were crops that were grown here in Montgomery County, so that when people are going through the immersion and they're tasting the food, it's from the land where this experience happened, the exact same taste that people 150 years ago will have. Another example. We use living history reenactors and programs to use history as a lens, not only for the past, but for the present, and the social change that has come out of decades of American history. We have programs for school groups. One's called Beyond the Big House. Parents love this program, teachers love this program because it's our slave life program. So we bring the kids out, they get off the bus, we put hose in their hands, and we put them in the fields working. And we actually run our farm with, pardon me, slave labor. Your kids, they get their SSL hours for it. But they do planting, cultivating, and harvesting of the crops. Some of what they harvest, we actually donate to local food banks such as Manna. And experiential programs. This group is following the waters of a local creek, a program we call Wade in the Water, which combines history with environmental conservation. So, thank you for coming out and hearing my crazy rambling story. We would like to invite you to the Button Farm this year. We open to the public on Heritage Days, which is June 29th this year. All the heritage sites are open. We're one of those sites. We also have a pretty vibrant volunteer programs and internships. So if anyone's interested in applying what you do here at MC to something that's interesting, we can always find a way. All right. Any questions? Yes. And if you can just step up and grab the mic.
Check. Is this on? Check.
Maybe.
Check, 2, 1, 2.
Yeah.
Check. Okay. So you were talking earlier about when you did your research and you talked to families. And you said it was like they could go back 200 years. Did you find any families that had links to, let's say, like famous figures from our textbooks that we learned in history from elementary school till now?
Yeah, that's very interesting. When I was in Sandy Spring, I found one family that actually had letters that we thought were these coded letters, and they have never been willing to have them shared. So a lot of those historical connections, I'm sure we don't even know. We have a number of families. For instance, the Edmondson family was an enslaved family here in Montgomery County, and two of the girls were part of a well-known slave escape in 1848, where about 70 slaves tried to escape aboard a ship out of Washington. Long story short, when they finally were put on the auction block, and abolitionists bought them off of the auction block, and they were relocated in the North, the story of the girls came under the notice of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and their profiles were used as part of her characterizations in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Josiah Henson, who lived on a farm in Rockville, 3 blocks from Green Acres School. The plantation house is still there. It's now owned by the Park and Planning Commission. His biography was used by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and his character was the model for Uncle Tom himself. So yes, there are some amazing.
Sounds like a lot.
It's a lot. Yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. You can either mic it or you can scream it. Oh, good.
You were talking about different locations and which ones were bad or good in terms of making their way north.
Yes.
How did they learn the different locations where they could find safety or couldn't?
Yeah, just escape. The question was, in case anyone didn't hear it, how could someone know as they were making their journey and trying to access the Underground Railroad, where it was safe to stop, where it was dangerous? That's a complex question. The answer is you didn't know. But if you were on the Underground Railroad, you were actually along an organized system of escape. So the Underground Railroad was operated by individuals and communities in the South and the North. In the South, it was loosely organized and got more efficient as it reached the Canadian border. Certain communities, such as the Quakers, were easy to access because of their dress and the way they spoke. Might be a clue. But in city centers in the South, Mid-Atlantic, and the North, which had free black populations, it was easy to get that information just by asking people. There were decoys. Sometimes free blacks could and would turn in fugitives to collect the reward. When you crossed the border and ended up in a free state, you weren't necessarily safe because the laws of the United States said wherever you were within America's borders, you were still in the condition of a slave, unless your owner had actually taken you to a free state, and then you could claim your freedom. So it was very dicey. Traditionally, knocks and codes, passwords. For instance, the name of our foundation, the Menare or Minari Foundation, was a passcode that was used on a route of the Underground Railroad. Where the first person learns, to say that, to take that chance, is still much of the mystery that surrounds the system. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm sorry. I have a question about your methods.
Yes.
I was thinking as you were doing this, would you do this again after 9/11?
Oh, no.
Would you put yourself in a box after?
Not the box.
And so I'm curious, given that sort of other historical change that has happened since then, I wonder, if you were going to, what would you do? Since you probably can't do that again, what would you do if you were going to do this?
It's funny. I'm kind of facing that question right now. Even crossing a border. When I crossed in 1996, I had a little place on the outskirts of Buffalo on the Niagara River called Black Rock Landing. And it used to be a fugitive crossing point. And it also used to be a crossing point for boats, probably as late as the 1950s, but not since then. And as I got closer to that to Canada, a group on the Canadian side and a group in Buffalo on the American side wanted to do something to honor my crossing. So they contacted immigration. They got permission to allow me to cross there by boat. I was the first person to cross in probably about 50 years. And U.S. immigration officer came down to the river's edge, took my passport. I'm standing there with the Niagara behind me, swearing the oath and all that kind of stuff, and that they asked me to. And then I went across, got to the other side, and Canadian immigration was there. Would never happen today. Could never happen. I'm actually doing one more walk, so to speak, this summer. I did my 96 walk. I did one in 98 from Alabama to Canada, 3 months through 10 states, because I thought I wanted to make a documentary. So I was testing a new route. When I got to Canada, I was researching in an archives in London, Ontario, and I found an 1856 interview with someone who I would later discover was my great-great-granduncle, who had escaped on the Underground Railroad from Savannah, Georgia, to Canada. And as I never even knew about him. I did recognize his name. It was a name on my family tree with no information. Later, I discovered it was the same person, and I discovered that he crossed from the U.S. into Canada at Black Rock Landing, the same place I crossed. So then I thought, wait, that's what my film's about. So I'm retracing his route. He got to Canada, and then he came back to the U.S., was captured, got to Canada again, and then came back a second time on Sherman's March to the Sea to liberate the town he escaped from. So I'm going to be following his route and whatnot. But, you know, I'll use that great footage I have, B-roll footage of my 96 walk, because I'll never be able to do a soft crossing like that again. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. You and Mike. Yes.
Could you please address the usage of the term enslaved person instead of the word slave, and also the increasing recognition that there was a lot of self-emancipation going on, and that things like the Emancipation Proclamation and things like legislation that was signed in the 60s, as important as the actions of whites were, that there was a huge movement on the part of blacks to bring about these changes?
Yeah. We keep learning about the past. Every day that passes, more questions are answered. And I know it sounds like mystic realism or something, but I honestly believe that history reveals itself at a time in which people are most able to deal with its meaning. Maybe I'm making it up. That's how it seems to me. So, for instance, you know, the early 20th century narrative was always about the Quaker family, you know, helping the trembling black person. Gosh, I wish I had this picture. A very famous painting by Charles Weber, which shows an actual station master, Levi Coffin, and his wife in a snowbound scene. And you know, the old man with the cane and his feet in bandages because he doesn't have shoes, you know, having escaped all the way to Indiana, are being, you know, gently brought indoors by the Coffins. Levi Coffin and his wife probably had 3,000 people pass through their station. And they were stalwarts of the abolitionist movement. And those people had to reach that station. You know, so his reach went into the South, but those people had to come out of the South. So by the 1960s, the narrative was shifting. With the Black Power movement, a lot of historians were then saying that blacks were the greatest of abolitionists because they had to take the first steps to free themselves. Now the pendulum is swinging the other way, or kind of back to the middle, because we're now discovering in attics and archives, and thanks to the internet, you know, you find things in collections that people put online that you never would have found before. So really it was, you know, a multicultural, a multi-denominational North and South movement. Underground Railroad really was hatched in the South, and many of the most ardent abolitionists were people who left their homes in the South. The Grimkes, the Coffins, people like that, they had to move to the North, and there they could speak out against slavery and operate systems that would help dismantle it. In terms of enslaved, I was born in 1963. I was born on the 100th anniversary, not the date, but the year of the Emancipation Proclamation. I was born in the year of the March on Washington and King's I Have a Dream speech. I say black. It's a throwaway term. I can't be reformed. I can't get African American out of my, it's just too many words. I'm 49. I have to preserve my words. But I know what it means, and I know it came out of especially the 80s and then into the 90s, and we needed that. We needed to establish that, we weren't, a blot on a Rorschach, test, that we couldn't be defined by our color, that we helped build this country. Strangely enough, a few years ago, I was going through, I have a run of William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator newspaper, which was begun in 1831, and really marks the beginning of the abolitionist movement. And in one paper I have, I think it's from 1833, he always has on the masthead, if that's what you call it, of the paper, an image. And this one is an image of the U.S. Capitol, and the Tree of Liberty is in the foreground, and a black man with a book is standing, reading to black children. And the caption underneath says, Afro-Americans learning to read. I nearly fell on my face. Afro-Americans, he invented that a century and a half before we use it now. We're all of those things. Marcus Garvey renewed the term Negro in 1920 because he was doing his Back to Africa movement, and he was trying to make the argument that we're of African blood, untainted by white blood, and we need to go back to the motherland. Yes, beautiful, empowering, yes. And his movement failed because by that time, African Americans or Americans of African descent were like, my people have been here for 200 years. I don't know Africa. I know America. And we're not going anywhere. And we're going to get our due. And we're going to get respect. And so all of those terms are part of the evolution. I say slave. I always feel that the term enslaved removes us from how people were seen at the time. Like I never referred to slaves as African Americans. They didn't have the rights to citizenship. I'm not going to take that away from them. So what I would encourage people to do is say what's comfortable for you and just stand behind what you say. It's the best we can do, yes. And thanks for the question. Great question.
Yep, my question, Tony, relates to a previous question about how did people know which direction to go, what was safe, what was not safe. This makes me think of early part of this century up through, particularly through the Depression, the early 20s and 30s, when we had this so-called hobo culture in our country, this great movement, migration of people of all races, and they had a code system. Have you encountered that? Does such a compendium of shapes and symbols and signs exist that you know of?
Well, this is controversial because in more recent years, I think people have wanted to put form, a form to the Underground Railroad, to find a more regimented system that might have been there. A good friend of mine, Raymond Dobard, along with Jacqueline Tobin, produced a book called Hidden in Plain View about quilt codes. And now it's come under a lot of I would say, attack. They took a story that they got from one person about a possible route using codes on a quilt, and applied it to the whole Underground Railroad. And after a few years of people really researching, they were able to unravel that. On the plantations, they had what was called the grapevine telegraph, word of mouth. Frederick Douglass comments, because he could read, that his master would throw the paper away. He would pull it out and go to a secret place and read about what was going on. People did that. One slave, I think from South Carolina, said that the neighboring plantations, each plantation had a slave who always had a cow horn, and they would blow the horn, and the horn had different pitches, so you could always tell who was blowing their horn, and that was the signal for meetings. So things did pass word of mouth. For some reason, all through the literature, people are talking about the North Star. They knew about it. They complained about it too. Followed that thing, got me further into slavery. Followed that thing, got me to freedom. Couldn't find the North Star because it's in the Little Dipper and it's really faint. So I just followed the Big Dipper since that was close enough, got to freedom. Ship captains coming down would bring news. Stow people away. There were all sorts of methods. It's believed that Black Masonic groups, some of the symbolism and secret codes and hand rubs and whatnot were on the Underground. We don't know. The thing I love about the Underground Railroad, we will never know. And that makes it strong. That validates its importance in history. It did not give up all of its secrets. Yes.
I wonder if you could speak about the history of emancipation in Maryland, and if there were changes to the Underground Railroad after the Emancipation Proclamation, and the effects of the Fugitive Slave Act on the Underground Railroad.
Oh, yes. Okay. So this is great because last week I testified along with Susan Soderberg. Susan, please stand up. Susan Soderberg is one of our best historians right here in Germantown. She runs the Germantown Historical Society. And we went and testified before the state legislature for a bill to establish November 1st as official Emancipation Day in Maryland. On November 1st, 1864, Maryland changed its constitution to abolish slavery. Maryland was a slave state, but it was a border state. It was forced to remain neutral during the Civil War. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is commonly said not to have freed a single slave because it applied only to slaves in the seceding states, which we did not have control over, and those places that remain neutral, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply. But it was symbolic, and it did more to free slaves just in its symbolism than anything else. It actually facilitated blacks going into the Union Army to fight on behalf of the Union. So it's a very complicated history. We, I guess, are the first of the remaining slave states to abolish slavery prior to the passing of the 13th Amendment. Here's a little a trade secret. There are just a couple of copies of the original Emancipation Proclamation. One is often on display at the National Archives. It's not always on display. You know, they tote it out every now and then. But I believe it is the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church on New York Avenue and 12th Street. they have in their basement a little historical exhibit, and they actually have one of the existing copies of the Emancipation Proclamation. So if you ever want to see it, give them a call, because you can probably see it any day of the week. Anyone else? Yes. Last question. Okay. And then I'll stay after if anyone has any. Yes.
Okay, first, thank you for coming tonight. We enjoyed it very much, or I did. My question is that we're studying Reconstruction period now, and what I'm finding is I'm just appalled that there didn't seem to be any kind of national debate about putting families back together. And Freedmen Bureau, people in the North, the Quakers, who do you think put the most focus in putting families back together? Was it just freed slaves themselves, or was there a mechanism, or?
Yeah, it's funny because, first of all, I stay within my bounds in terms of the Underground Railroad. It's commonly believed that with the start of the Civil War, there was no need for the Underground Railroad, so it stopped then. I don't believe that. That's an area of scholarship that needs to be pursued. And on the tail end of that is, I think, an issue that you bring up. Evidently, or so I'm told by scholars who are actually working on this, that for the first 2 decades after slavery ended, many Southern papers and some Northern papers carried ads of people looking for family members. It's kind of crazy. And yeah, there are, every now and then I read of a dramatic a reunion. But people were, moved to the far, corners of the country. Sometimes their names were changed. Sometimes they were split up as children, and were unrecognizable as adults. That would be a great thing to research and hang your PhD around. And I think,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, I think that's a good one. The Freedmen's Bureau records do have letters attached to them. They were for the time that they exist, really looking for those answers. One thing you should all do is just Google the name William Still, S-T-I-L-L. He was a Philadelphia station master who for 10 years kept a diary, secreted away, which contained the names of everyone who went through his station in Philadelphia. Henry Box Brown went through his station, and he's pictured. This thing is public domain. You can find it on Google Books, Project Gutenberg. Just download it. It's about 900 pages. About that many people went through him. But one of the reasons he kept his ledger, which he did at great risk to himself, was so he believed that slavery would perish one day, and that people who had escaped and got to freedom would come back to find the people they were separated from. And so that's why he kept that ledger, so people could reunite with their family, which is just crazy that he would have that kind of insight and that his book would survive. He then published that ledger as a book in 1871, and his papers are at the Pennsylvania Historical Society in Philadelphia, and there are just stacks of letters. Another great source to mine for your PhD. So, all right. Thank you very much. You're a fantastic audience.